Welcome everyone to API World 2023. We're in the Expo Innovation stage. I would like to present our next speaker, Timo Rüppell, VP of Product at FireTail. Please come onto stage. Hi, you're all set.
All right, thank you. So thanks for that introduction. And yeah, today we're going to talk about API security by design. So thanks everybody for joining me today with this topic. My aim in this talk is I want to convince you that contrary to popular opinion, security is not a chore. And also it should not be that difficult. So this talk is not going to focus on the nitty-gritty implementation details. There are tons of great reference grade books out there that I'll link a couple of them in the talk. Instead, this talk should give you an understanding of how security considerations can be brought into the various stages of an API's lifecycle. And it should also give you some actionable tips and tools to do so. We're looking at some basic foundations first. We will do a small threat modeling exercise. We're going to check out some aspects of API development, and finally check out the most important tool for secure API development at the end. So before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Timo Rüppell, and I'm the VP of Product at FireTail. I am originally a classically trained theoretical physicist, so I will also be available for questions about black holes and string theory, or you can email me about those. We can have a chat. It's fun stuff, really. After my PhD, I was looking for something actually hard to do and decided that writing maintainable JavaScript would be a perfect fit. So I moved on to the startup world, and now, roughly 2 decades later, the challenge rating has gone up somewhat. Writing JavaScript became full stack development, which became designing and building whole services, and maintainability has grown to encompass security. And so far, I haven't regretted the decision. I'm also coming to you today from Helsinki, Finland, and being that I'm probably more aware than most people in the audience of the following fact. And this is unfortunately true figuratively for APIs, as well as it is true literally for my home country. The thing that I should point out, though, is that it does take them an entire 7 seasons for winter to actually show up. So this might not be as alarmist as you might assume. However, if you take a step back, it is easy to see that there is cause for concern. There has been an industry-wide shift happening in how modern web applications and services are built, and in how existing services provide more and better access to their own APIs. Indeed, there is an entire service category nowadays for applications that specialize in connecting other applications' APIs together. And the driver for this change is the enormous economic value for everybody participating in this free exchange of APIs. Now, as is usually the case where there's economic value, bad actors are not far behind. And the number of what we would call pure API incidents are growing year over year. And they are on average also much more heavyweight than traditional incidents measured by exposed number of records or volume of data, for example. So I'll also not go into much detail here. For one, I assume that I'm preaching to the choir. And secondly, there's a much more detailed talk available on this subject by our CEO, Jeremy Snyder, that you can find on our website. If you're also interested in keeping up to date, we have an API security incident tracker on our website. The link is at the bottom here, and you can sign up and follow that. So with the motivations out of the way, let's move on to a quick checkup on security principles. This is the CIA triad. It's an established way of thinking about the security of IT systems. Integrity covers essentially making sure that the data is only ever modified in expected and intended ways. Confidentiality is broadly about guarding access to the data. And my personal favorite is availability, because without availability, the other two are actual trivialities. You could just encrypt your data, throw away the key, chuck the data to the bottom of the ocean, and you'd have perfect confidentiality and perfect integrity without much use. So while there may seem like abstract top-level concepts, it is actually easy to connect these concepts to concrete security concerns. So everybody here is likely familiar with the top 10 OWASP list. If not, I highly recommend reading up on it. We also, again, have published a guide on the topic, and you can find a recent webinar on our website as well. It should be noted that although quite extensive, this is only a top 10 list, and you can look at the 2019 list for some additional items, for example, that are no longer on the top 10 list. This list enumerates the most severe symptoms of failures in the underlying aspects of security, and I've linked these here in this nice slide. So when designing an API with security in mind, I would recommend focusing on the 3 core principles instead of just blindly checking off the OWASP top 10 list or any other list. That is not to say that the OWASP top 10 list is useless. In fact, it is extremely useless because with a good understanding of the real world attack vectors, what you can do is you can figure out how to effectively allocate your resources to your defenses. So with that in mind, let's make a quick threat modeling exercise. Let's take a look at how those OWASP top 10 items line up on a typical API call. So this is a slightly simplified view of a standard API call. For our purposes, I have included some of the traditional web security steps like WAF and rate limiting. We have authentication, which can, and in many cases is separated and delegated to a third-party solution or centralized solution. Then we have the application layer, by which we mean the part where the request is processed by any middleware and handed off to a handler function. And in this stage, there may also be calls to third-party APIs. Many of the important steps around API security can only be done in this layer. So for example, sanitizing request parameters, validation, authorization, etc. And that is because usually at the network layer, you don't have visibility into these aspects of a request. Also note that in some of these steps, they should be applied to the response objects or response payloads as well. So let's investigate where the OWASP top 10 issues appear in this view. So we'll skip points 8 and 9, because those affect the setup and management of the API as a whole, and not individual API calls as such. I'll also go slightly out of order to have this flow nicely. So the first one is broken authentication, and this can be completely external to the application layer, if indeed it is being handled by a separate process or a third party. The other thing that can be handled by traditional web security functions is unrestricted usage of an API. However, this depends on the application. This may have to be dealt with during the validation stage or by the business logic itself. This is the case when instead of repeated requests, you can simply set a query parameter to a high value and that way get unrestricted resource access. Again, this is not something that a WAF can easily help you with. So the next 3 items on the top 10 list are all failures in authorization. And finally, the last 2 items sit in the application layer as well. So when you look at the top 10 OWASP list in this process, you can appreciate what we mean when we say that the traditional web security does not really protect you against the current OWASP top 10. So obviously, you should still do TLS and rate limiting, etc. But with the exception of authentication, and in some cases, the unrestricted access, all of the OWASP top 10 issues are application layer problems. And of these, the top 3 are authorization issues. So this exercise should give you a good idea about where to spend time and attention when working on the security of your APIs. Next, I want to take a look at two important meta aspects of APIs or software development in general. Number one is the fact that your API is going to affect many different parties who will have entirely separate needs and requirements from your API. So just the existence of multiple stakeholders yields one of the most important top tips for API development in general, which is documentation. So this is key for any form of collaboration, obviously, but I want to stress that even for a single person company, you should absolutely not work on an API without documentation. Even if you are working on an internal API that does not have external consumers, your future self from 2 years in the future will thank you for properly documenting all your weird but brilliant at the time design decisions, speaking from experience here. The other universal truth about all software development is that it's never truly finished. Instead, it goes through a feedback cycle of continuous improvement and refinement. So during this cycle, features may change, be replaced, or removed. And as a rookie developer, the first time you end up with a feature in the retirement bubble is exactly the time when you realize the second most important thing about API development, which is versioning. So this obviously primarily helps API consumers in their own development cycles, but it also helps with security issues like debugging and incident forensics. It can allow the DevOps team to verify only allowed versions of an API are deployed. And for maximum effectiveness, you should consider to have the version information present in responses and logs and most places that are useful. Also consider that it should not only be the endpoints themselves that have versioning, but data models and response data formats as well, especially if these are complex. So if we spread this field open, we can get an overview of some additional factors affecting the API ownership experience. And this is a lot of stuff here. And this is where handling all of this may definitely feel like difficult, lemon difficult, but it's not as bad as it looks. I have highlighted the part where most people put most of their effort. And that is not entirely bad that they do. This single item can fill an entire university course by itself. And as already mentioned at the top of the talk, I won't get into the nitty-gritty of all of these best practices, such as never use integers for anything that's not a quantity, always have limited strings, etc. So I'll only point out a couple of very good practical resources on the topic. So JJ Giwax and Arnaud Lorette are both experts in the fields, and they've written reference grade books on the topics of API best practices. I can highly recommend these for anybody working on an API. So my job is to convince you that it does not actually require that much effort to take care of all of these other boxes. So we already talked about the collaborative aspect of API design. For a given feature, you usually start out with the expected usage patterns and data content that a consumer needs. This leads to data models, functionality concerns, importantly, access control. And access control, again, can include admin actions and admin functions, or function for the security or customer success team separately. So in this process, overall, if I were to guess, the most neglected part for most APIs is the compliance teams box. And here I must admit to having slightly fibbed. This box is not actually lemon difficult, lemon difficult, but it is boring. You should consider the fact that large GDPR fines are on the rise, as is consumer awareness of privacy issues. So there is really no way around but to RTFM on this. And again, it might be boring, but you can also find a person like me who thinks that this is actually quite interesting. The law is actually not that complicated. It's been around for close to 8 years. There are good resources around and few excuses not to be up to date on this. You'll need to figure out what kind of data you process, whether it contains personally identifiable information. You may need to figure out what is personally identifiable information if you're just starting out. You need to figure out what regulations you might need to follow and what kind of practical requirements those may bring to your functioning of the API. Overall, I can tell you from personal experience that retrofitting mechanisms for legal holds or lockouts or consent tracking is not something that you want to spend your time on. None of those things are rocket science. They're really simple. And if you do them from the get-go, it takes no time to incorporate them. So that is sort of the caveat aside. Fortunately, the rest of these items that are highlighted are all covered by documentation and versioning. And these are things we're already doing. You just need to use a documentation method that will actually help you keep track of all of these things and help you with all of these things. And more on that in a minute. So the next big chunk of work relates to how your API is deployed and how availability is ensured. Again, entire university course material here. However, the singular easiest tip to help with most of the security issues around DevOps is infrastructure as code. There's nothing more satisfying than being able to deploy your entire service with a single command. Having return time objectives of less than 4 hours, for example. Start using Terraform or CDK or similar tools if you're not already. And the eagle-eyed among you may have already spotted what the remaining items have in common, and that is monitoring. Now, monitoring may be the easiest of all of these to slap on after the fact, but again, I sincerely hope that instead everybody implements monitoring from the get-go. Again, not having monitoring is like flying blind. It's technically possible, but it's an accident waiting to happen. So this topic includes everything from application logging, API request logging, change monitoring for your deployments, etc. And there are tons of tools to help you. And again, visit our website to sign up for a demo of a really fantastic one. And voila, that's it. With just these few things, you have pretty much everything covered and greatly expanded the security stance of your API. So now let's take a look at the biggest impact item here, which is documentation. There are a few options when it comes to documenting your API. The current king of the hill is OpenAPI, which is formerly called Swagger. It is operated by the Linux Foundation. It's a solid project. And together with API Blueprint, which I think is owned by Oracle, they sit in the documentation as code camp, which is to say that they are document formats that can be used by automation tools. The opposite of this is code as documentation, which is represented by GraphQL and Protocol Buffer, which is used by gRPC. And then you have sort of a middle ground JSON schema, which is a generic JSON validation framework, which can be used to roll your own. And it's also used internally by some of the tools that operate on OpenAPI specs, for example, especially in the request and response validations. Now, abstractly, the greatest function that documentation has is as a single source of truth. This is why it's so good for collaboration. These formats make it possible to take this truth and turn it into automation for all the things. Remember the thread modeling we did earlier? So using OpenAPI and tooling like Connection or Express OpenAPI makes it actually trivial to ensure proper authentication, validation, sanitization. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of tools for mocking, linting, testing, fuzzing. There are IDE integrations, etc., etc. However, for example, authorization is not covered by the OpenAPI spec. We have a project in closed beta around this. And again, if you're interested, send us a message, sign up at the website if you're interested in talking about that. But overall, look at this list. When you look at which problems automated documentation solves, and when you take into account where documentation helps in the stakeholder and lifecycle stages, you can see why we say that documentation is actually the single most important thing that you can do for your API's security. So we're finishing up a little bit early, but I hope that this talk has provided you with an overview of some of the things that you can take into your API design process, have given you a new perspective on how to approach API security and get the most bang for your buck when you're working on your API.
Thank you so much, Timo, for your presentation. I hope everyone gained some insight from his talk. Looking forward to finishing up today, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this session in our Expo Innovation stage. Please feel free to ask questions and connect with Timo here. And I think we have a question right now. I'm not sure if this was covered, but can you speak about make a threat model?
Yes. So in general, the general concept of a threat model is a good thing to understand. So it basically means that you need to understand what kind of things are possibly harmful or going to adversely affect your APIs, for example. This might be depending on what kind of an API is it. Is it a financial application? Does it contain healthcare information? That is sort of part of the threat modeling, for example. Another part of the threat modeling might be how it is actually connected to other applications. What kind of customers are you serving, etc. So in our example, I was using the OWASP top 10 list because that enumerates the sort of most prevalent attack vectors / issues with APIs. And that sort of gives you an idea of where to look for problems that you might have in your API development. Again, there's a good talk about recent incidents and how they have grown over the past years. And in that, for example, we can see that authentication and authorization are the lion's share of all incidents, for example, that happen. So that, again, can help you figure out where to actually put most of your development work effort when you're trying to secure your API. This is an important step in sort of planning your development cycle.
Great. Awesome to hear. Thank you again so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here. And please make your way to your next sessions. And we look forward to seeing you here at API World 2023. See you guys.
Bye-bye.